day 1014 of this Trump administration. Another day of nearly hourly developments in the impeachment inquiry, including more testimony, and the clock is underway toward tomorrow's initial vote of the House. This is a resolution to lay out the impeachment process, in effect. In the meantime, and looking ahead tonight, House Democrats have told former National Security Advisor John Bolton they want him to testify about the Trump White House and Ukraine. Tonight, Bolton's lawyer says he's not willing to appear voluntarily, but that he stands ready to accept a subpoena. Fiona Hill, who worked for Bolton, reportedly testified that he referred to the Ukraine pressure campaign as a, quote, drug deal, and spoke of Rudy Giuliani as a hand grenade who's going to blow everybody up. Well, tomorrow, congressional investigators will be hearing from another member of Bolton's national security team, a guy by the name of Tim Morrison. He listened in on that now infamous July 25 phone call with the president of Ukraine. Last week, Ambassador Bill Taylor testified that Morrison told him about this decision to block nearly $400 million in military aid that our Congress had approved to go to Ukraine until investigations were launched into the Bidens. Well, late this afternoon, there was a notable development when we learned that Mr. Morrison, on the eve of his testimony, is in fact quitting his job at the National Security Council. He'll be giving his closed-door deposition as the House resolution is brought up for consideration. This afternoon, the Rules Committee in the House voted to move that approved language forward to the House floor.
When our founders drafted the Constitution more than 230 years ago, they included a process that could lead to removing a president from office if he or she abused their power. This Congress, with our existing authority under the Constitution and the rules of the House, is in the midst of an impeachment inquiry right now. I don't know whether President Trump will be impeached. Only the facts and how we respond to them will dictate that. But I can tell you this. This process determining whether he should be impeached will be open to the public view, just as it should be.
Congressman McGovern of Massachusetts. Earlier today, two more witnesses testified to lawmakers about how outsiders appeared to be trying to influence this administration's policy on Ukraine. State Department officials Catherine Croft and Christopher Anderson each met behind closed doors with House investigating committees. Anderson was special advisor for Ukraine negotiations until this past July. In his opening statement, he said Bolton warned him about Rudy's efforts to influence Trump on Ukraine. Croft took over for Anderson in July after spending 2 years as a director covering Ukraine over on the National Security Council. This morning, she told lawmakers that lobbyist Robert Livingston, you may remember this man, longtime Republican congressman from Louisiana. He is the former House Speaker-elect during the time of President Clinton's impeachment, that he pushed to remove the one-time U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Maria Yovanovitch, calling her, quote, an Obama holdover. We're also learning more about what Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman told members of Congress during his testimony yesterday. NBC News reports he testified that a White House meeting between Trump and the president of Ukraine, as well as that military aid package, was contingent on Ukrainian officials carrying out multiple investigations. Politico reporting Vindman also said an associate of Republican Congressman Devin Nunes misrepresented himself to Trump in an attempt to influence Ukraine policy. Some of the key aspects of the impeachment inquiry, specifically who knew about what, also emerged today during a Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing. Under oath was this man, number 2 guy at the State Department under Pompeo, John Sullivan. He is hoping to be confirmed as the next U.S. ambassador to Russia.
Do you think it's ever appropriate for the president to use his office to solicit investigations into a domestic political opponent?
Soliciting investigations into a domestic political opponent, I don't think that would be in accord with our values.
You were aware that there were individuals and forces outside of the State Department seeking to smear Ambassador Yovanovitch. Is that correct?
I was.
And did you know Mr. Giuliani was one of those people?
I believed he was, yes.
Were you aware that Rudy Giuliani had opened a second channel of diplomacy, if you want to call it that, a second channel of effort in Ukraine?
As I said in response to questions from Senator Menendez, I was aware that that Mr. Giuliani was was involved in Ukraine issues.
So that's about the way that went. And here for our leadoff discussion on a Wednesday night, Shannon Pettypiece, veteran journalist and senior White House reporter for NBC News Digital, Mika Ouyang, attorney, former staffer for both House Intel and Armed Services Committees, and Andrew Desiderio, congressional reporter for Politico. Good evening. Welcome to you all. Andrew, I'd like to begin with you and your beat just to remind us, what does Bolton testimony get you? How big a fish is he considered in all of this, considering how much is already in there on the record?
Well, considering what we already know about what has been testified to behind closed doors, is that John Bolton was a witness to these efforts, these shadow efforts by Trump-aligned associates and consultants to try to implement a shadow foreign policy that was inconsistent with the foreign policy that the U.S. diplomatic and national security apparatus was pushing. Obviously, John Bolton, as someone who led the National Security Council for so long and has been a Russia hawk for so long, was very invested in the idea of supporting Ukraine and making sure they had the resources to push back against Russian aggression. And we've learned from the testimony that when he learned that Rudy Giuliani was trying to push something that the U.S. was trying to warn against, essentially, he was becoming very alarmed at it. We heard from Fiona Hill, the president's former top Russia aide, to that effect. We heard, of course, from Colonel Vindman yesterday, who backed up a lot of Fiona Hill's assertions. And then, of course, William Taylor last week, the top diplomat to Ukraine. So it seems like the nexus here always comes back to John Bolton, in that he was aware of these efforts, and not just aware, but he was very concerned and alarmed. And that's why I think House Democrats really want his testimony at this point.
So, Mika, you're the lawyer in this conversation. When a John Bolton says, I'm not going to just respond to your invite, but I would accept a subpoena, do you take them at his word?
I think you do. And we've seen this happen with other witnesses coming before the committees of inquiry, where they have said, hey, I am willing to come, but you're going to have to force me to come. I can't come voluntarily. It's interesting because my understanding is that John Bolton shares an attorney with another witness that's been asked to come, who has said, look, I have to go seek legal guidance because I need to find out whether or not the administration's attempts to bar me from appearing are legal or not. So they're not doing the outright obstruction that we saw coming out of the Trump White House, but they are not coming fully voluntarily the way that we have seen Ambassador Taylor and others come.
So, Shannon, I want to read you a piece of reporting from the Associated Press just to remind us about the circumstances when Bolton left. Morrison, this gentleman who's testifying tomorrow, told people after Bolton was forced out of his job that the national security advisor had tried to stop Giuliani's diplomatic dealings with Ukraine, and that Morrison agreed. And Shannon, it's just more evidence that every day there's just more evidence. And it's these people from the inside. This will now make two people who heard the call happening contemporaneously.
And that undercuts this argument that Republicans have been trying to make of, first, we don't have anyone with direct firsthand knowledge of the call. Well, we now do have someone with direct firsthand knowledge of the call. They have tried to say, well, Bill Taylor and his assertion there was a quid pro quo. That's just one person. We don't have anyone backing that up. Well, they now do have someone backing that up, because that is essentially what Vindman said yesterday, is that the aid to Ukraine, the meeting with the White House, was contingent, as he said, on these investigations going through. So while these witnesses in the next few days and that we saw today may not bring any sort of new revelations, they are backing up the current revelations that we have. And I would note, the White House is really in the dark here. They don't know what anyone is going to say. They don't really know what John Bolton is going to say. And part of that is because they're refusing to cooperate with this investigation. I mean, the White House doesn't even know what exactly is said in these hearing rooms. And that's a contrast to the Mueller investigation, where the White House was cooperating, where every witness from the White House who went in to talk to Mueller went in and talked to the White House counsel's office. The lawyers between those witnesses and the White House counsel's office were coordinating, were discussing. They had a clear picture of what was going on. Because the White House is not cooperating in this, they do not have a lawyer in the hearing room, and the White House lawyers cannot exchange any information at all with the witnesses who are going forward.
Shannon, what an excellent point. And going into another day tomorrow, they again don't know exactly what it is we'll be reporting on 24 hours from now. Hey, Andrew, since we've been on the air, 3 other guests on this broadcast, Carol Leonnig, Tom Hamburger, and Greg Miller over at the Washington Post have broken this. Here's the headline: White House lawyer moved transcript of Trump call to classified server. Where have we heard that expression before? After Ukraine advisor raised alarms. So we all know the broad outlines of this story. Mr. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman testified yesterday. He hears the president on the phone with the president of Ukraine. And in places later replaced by ellipses, 3 dots, he hears the president talking about things that weren't reflected on the transcript or the summary that we saw. This now alleges that the lawyer at the NSC is the one who made the call to put it in a more secure place. Does this, by your reading, Andrew, imply any guilt or innocence or any conclusion?
Well, my first thought is that it corroborates the whistleblower's complaint even further. You'll recall that the third most central point that the whistleblower complaint was making was that there was an effort to shield the contents of the president's conversation with President Zelensky by putting it onto a classified server that usually these transcripts do not go on. And yesterday, of course, we learned late last night, rather, after Vindman testified for more than 10 hours behind closed doors, that he was trying to sort of get a more correct version of the transcript out there in terms of the one that was released publicly, including adding references to Burisma, of course, the Ukrainian energy company where Hunter Biden served on the board of. And he was trying to essentially make it more accurate so that the public could get an accurate reading of it. But he was essentially, he was voted down in that respect. And it all comes back to that whistleblower complaint, though, and the extent to which it's being corroborated behind closed doors. And that's my first thought hearing this Washington Post story tonight.
So, Mika, by dint of your experience in the House of Representatives, you know that in normal times, if it's a foot race between Molasses and the House calendar, Molasses wins walking away. However, all of this has been fast-tracked. Having said that, do you have any idea, just a viewer's guide, as to timing? Start with when we'll see the first public hearings, perhaps.
So it's not clear when we'll see the first public hearings, but now that they have this resolution that'll come forward, which will allow Chairman Schiff to set public hearings, we now have a process going forward that will be more transparent so the American people can see what these witnesses have said behind closed doors. Chairman Schiff had said earlier that he would make statements and witness evidence public once it no longer compromised the inquiry itself. And what, as Shannon pointed out, since the White House doesn't know what's happening, they can't put pressure on witnesses to try and conform to a particular story. They go in and what they say is black box so that they can then check it against other witnesses. We'll see all that come out. But again, the House has made very clear they want this done before the end of the year, and nothing motivates members of Congress to get something done than leaving for the holidays.
Absolutely. Don't get between them and National Airport. It'll be at your peril. Shannon, a point you started to make, and I want to finish on it, and that is the art of distraction, the shiny object. All of the arguments we've been seeing, secret court process, kangaroo court, there have been Republicans in these depositions all the while. Aren't the Republicans about to lose all those talking points when all of this gets televised on this network and others? And more than that, we get to read all these depositions with secrets redacted for national security.
Well, yes, there is this assumption that transparency will work in the Republicans' favor, that they will get a chance to present a counter narrative or chip away at these witnesses. They kind of think back to the Blasey Ford testimony where they feel like they were able to turn the tables on that narrative against Kavanaugh once her testimony was actually public and Republicans were able to sort of dig in and go after her character. But that is assuming that the facts aren't on your side, assuming that the facts won't be on your side. And transparency could really come and get them. They don't know what these witnesses are going to say. They have an idea now that they've had some of these closed-door hearings to give them an idea of where this is going. But they might not necessarily want a television clip of some of the things that are going to be said in these hearings coming out forward. But that said, I think they will, if the talking points have to move from process to something else, they will shift those. And the president is staying on a message, like we saw with the Mueller investigation, of no quid pro quo, whether it is true or not, whether it is contradicted. He will stick to that. It is the new no collusion. He will repeat it over and over again, along with this is a witch hunt, and hope that it gets imprinted in the American public psyche, similar to how he felt it did in the Mueller investigation. So I think developments aside, that's where the president is going, and they will stick to a message. They will deny. They will attempt to discredit, just as we saw them do during the Mueller investigation.
A great point to end on, and thank you for that. Three of our returning veterans, Shannon Pettypiece, Mika Oyang, Andrew Desiderio, thank you all for starting us off on a Wednesday night.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.